my now former PhD student. She passed her Viva in flying colors in January after a journey of around 3 to 4 years. And it has been a very beautiful journey. Working with Rosie has been really nice. She was already skilled in research, being the research lead in SOS International before even coming in to IDS. But also she's been very willing to listen to our feedback and take it on and take it much further each time. It's been very lovely to work with her. And we have pushed her thinking, but she's pushed our thinking as well. So you will hear about the study in a very riveting talk about all the details about how children who could be considered refugees, but also return migrants. So you will hear about Syrian Armenian children who have moved from Syria due to war and into Armenia to become settled as or not as Armenians in Syria, but speaking another language than the Armenians and having a lot of integration to do. So Rosie has really managed to get out what children's experiences were of this and how they navigated that, and then contextualize beautifully with the parents' accounts and with the support services working with this group of refugees, return migrants. And Rosie was examined by Charles Waters from the Sussex Wellbeing Centre, and then by Elaine Chase from London School. Well, where's she? University, UCL. So instead of me waffling on, let me give the word to Rosie. Thank you very much.
Okay, I hope you can hear me well. Thank you so much, Dorte, for the lovely introduction. I can only say that it was also a pleasure to be supervised by you throughout this PhD journey. And thanks also to Charles for the opportunity to co-host this seminar together with IDS. And thank you everyone for coming here. It's nice to see some familiar faces, but also some new faces, and to those who have joined online, also a warm welcome. So yeah, as Dorte's mentioned, my name is Rosie Willi. I've been working in the child protection and development sector for almost 15 years now. And yeah, I was really excited to do this doctoral project alongside my PhD and really explore children's well-being from slightly different perspectives than I had done in my professional career previously. So just to take you through briefly the agenda for today's talk. So I'll talk a little bit about the research motivation and why I'm so fascinated by the buzzword well-being, and then share a little bit more about the context of Syrian Armenian communities in Armenia before outlining my child-centered participatory research methodology and some ethical practices that I employed to also enable the participation of children of various ages. Yeah, no problem. Oh, it's yes, there we go. Yeah, no problem. Exactly. Before I come to the heart of the presentation, which is all about the findings and different understandings of well-being that I encountered, also how well-being relates to mobility experiences and aspirations of the children that I met, and finally also the role of support services for children's well-being. So coming to why this project. So well-being is really a buzzword in the development sector. There are countless well-being dashboards, objective indicators and measures to look at, for example, employment or education outcomes, subjective indicators measuring quality of life and happiness, for instance. And when it comes to children's well-being, there has been a real upsurge in multidimensional child well-being indicators, especially since UNICEF's seminal publication on child well-being in European countries from 2007 onwards. But these indicators have also been subject to critique by scholars, saying that they're mainly informed by notions of children's development in high-income contexts, and that they haven't necessarily been informed by the voices of children across the globe. And I also encountered that in my work. So I've been engaged in designing well-being indicators for children and then measuring impact of interventions on children's well-being. And with time, I started to wonder kind of whose well-being were we measuring here and for whom? And I really wanted with this project to turn what I'd been previously doing on its head and really go from the vantage point of children rather than from the intervention. So what I do in this research is really to gauge children's perspective of well-being and then how that corresponds to intervention frameworks. So, and as Daughter already mentioned, I had the absolute honor to really delve into a very specific, also historically significant case, namely the relocation of Syrian Armenian communities from Syria who had actually been living in Syria for roughly 100 years. They had been displaced due to the Armenian genocide in 1914. And had lived in quite close-knit communities across Syria, mainly in Aleppo, but also in other urban centers. And they were displaced due to the Syrian war commencing in 2011. So roughly 22,000 Syrian Armenians decided to relocate to Armenia. And this is a relatively understudied group when you look at studies on displaced populations from Syria. So the majority of studies have really focused on refugee reception countries like Jordan and Lebanon or Europe. And there are very few studies on the experiences of children. And this is also a very interesting case and a case of scholarly debate, especially in the diaspora community, about whether this move to Armenia represents a homecoming or actually a renewed diaspora. And for that reason, I've situated this study in the return mobilities paradigm, because return can have multiple meanings across space, time, across generations, different people. And also mobilities is more of a flexible concept to look at migratory movements. And that's especially important in the case of Syrian Armenians because they're still a very mobile population group with only around 14,000 left in Armenia, many of whom have now moved on to other places. And what's also significant about this particular case is the situation that these families and children encountered in Armenia. So Armenia has been embroiled in a conflict with Azerbaijan, which flared up in 2020 and 2023. Actually, the flare-up in 2023 caused more than 100,000 people from Nagorno-Karabakh to be displaced to Armenia. Then also the COVID crisis had a very big impact on children's schooling for 1.5 years. And then finally also the Ukraine war saw the move of approximately 80,000 Russians to Armenia, which considerably increased housing prices and then put a further burden on Syrian Armenian families. And when we look at studies about the situation of Syrian Armenians in Armenia, many of them talk about struggling in the areas of housing, employment, healthcare. And there's, as Daughter mentioned, also a language barrier. So Syrian Armenians, they speak Western Armenian, whereas in Armenia, Eastern Armenian is spoken, as well as Russian as a second language. What was interesting also about this case is that the Armenian state has a program of repatriation politics. So Armenia has a population of around 3 million people, but there are 7 to 10 million diaspora Armenians around the world. So they are really interested in getting diaspora Armenians to come because there is quite some outward migration. So the Armenian state offered special citizenship provisions for Syrian Armenians so that they would get citizenship more easily. And I will talk a little bit later about how that then manifested within families, because actually there was then quite a patchwork of citizenship statuses for various reasons, which I'll talk about later. And then finally, coming to some of the support service providers that I looked at. So when planning to do my research, I wasn't really expecting so many organizations to provide support services for Syrian Armenians, but there was really numerous different types of local, national NGOs, many funded by international development donors from Europe, like Germany, Austria, the EU, with a vested interest in keeping the population in Armenia rather than them moving to Europe, so part of their migration agendas. And what was interesting around the time of my field work in 21 and 2022 is that a lot of the support was shifting from humanitarian assistance to more development support to none at all, because a lot of the focus was now shifting to displaced populations from Nagorno-Karabakh. And the families also felt this and knew about the imminent end of support. So what's kind of special about my research is that I've combined a well-being approach with a family mobilities approach, which is child-centered. And there are quite a few studies that aim to do that, especially in such a context of return mobilities. And that considers family dynamics, and especially this type of case of south-to-south migration, and then on top of that also looks at how interventions serve these families. So those would be the primary evidence gaps that this study explores. And when we talk about well-being, what do I mean by well-being actually? So the concept that I draw on is the Bath Group's well-being and development approach, which sees well-being as a process that changes over time and space. And there are three main dimensions. So the first one would be the material well-being, which is all that concerns assets, welfare, and standards of living. And then relational well-being, the social relationships in people's lives and human capabilities, as well as the subjective, so people's values, norms, and their perspectives on their positioning in society. However, this well-being framework has never been used with children. So I was thinking about how I could adapt it to really suit this context of return mobility. So I took an explicitly intersectional approach and looked at how gender, age, and generation shape children's experiences of well-being. Also identity, so how does diaspora Armenian versus Armenian identity affect well-being experiences, and also class. And then I also recognize that children's lives are processes of human development that are shaped by close social relationships, but also more distant societal contexts. So here I integrated Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological approach to look at those different layers in children's lives. And maybe what's also important to mention about this framework is that I then use it as an analytical tool in my work. So I actually map the data that I collected onto this framework in order to understand whether it actually works out in its use in practice in this type of research context. So just to recap quickly the central research question. So I'm centering on well-being experiences from the perspective of children and their families in the context of support services. So what I investigate are understandings of well-being, and then the strategies of well-being that children employ and how they relate to their mobility experiences, and then finally the role of support services and interventions therein. Okay, so now coming to the methodology. This study can be characterized as a child-centered qualitative study. So I used a mix of ethnographic and participatory methods. I conducted 9 months of fieldwork in Yerevan, the capital, where most Syrian Armenians had moved to. And I also worked with 2 research assistants, and here it was really important that they were also diaspora Armenians, so they spoke both Western and Eastern Armenian. I also speak some Arabic, so some fieldwork was conducted in Arabic, and actually the children mainly wanted to speak in English with me. So they had done their schooling in Lebanon or Syria, and English is a second language there, so they were really keen to use that in the majority of cases. And I also was supported by SOS Children's Villages in Armenia to kind of set up different networks and get to know the first families before I then snowballed out to also reach families supported by other organizations. So I worked with a core group of 28 children aged between 3 and 21, young people aged 21 years old. I engaged with most of these children repeatedly over time, and the remaining participants were their adult family members, such as grandparents or parents that were living with the children in the families, but also professionals. So from NGO workers, frontline professionals like psychologists or social workers, but also government officials and donors. Maybe here it's important to mention something about my ethical approach, because I wanted to be really careful in terms of, and I took ample time to prepare for the fieldwork also with local psychologists who had worked with this population before. But at the same time, I wanted to avoid this victimhood gaze, because many studies that study children in migration focus more on adversities and presuppose that these children might have trauma, for example. So while I wanted to be really sensitive to possible traumas that they might have due to wartime experiences, I also didn't want to exclusively focus the study on that. And that's why well-being as a concept was actually quite useful, because it helped me acknowledge adversities, but not specifically focus on them in the research. So at this point, I won't go more into the ethical practice that I used, and also kind of, for example, repeated consent procedures, etc. But I'm happy to talk more about that later. So maybe we can come to the methods, because I was really careful at tailoring the methods to children of different ages and abilities. And I had 5 main methods that I used. So kind of the heart of the research were the 12 family case studies that I did, where with different family members, depending on their preference, I would use different types of methods like draw and tell, life history interviews, and social network mapping. I also carried out 5 group activities in the form of well-being workshops and a photovoice workshop, 24 stakeholder interviews with professionals, as well as ad hoc interactions with diaspora Armenians in Yerevan, and participant observation at social services, both in Yerevan but also in rural areas, so I could get a bit of a perspective of differences in populations. And here is just an illustration of some of the methods that I used. So first one is a picture from one of the well-being workshops, where children were asked first to draw a child not doing well in their community and then doing well. And then we workshopped some of the strategies to enhance children's well-being in their community. And I did this with different age groups. And the other pictures depict more individual methods, where I used, for example, draw and tell to ask children about what their personal flag would look like, social network maps to inquire about children's important people in their lives, or people who are maybe less important and why. Also life history mapping exercises, as well as the photovoice workshop, which kind of I didn't necessarily plan to do in the beginning, but there was a group of children who were interested in doing this method. So we picked a research question together, which was, what is home for me? And then the children went out and photographed that concept and came back, and we discussed it and then created a photo book. And one more note on the methodology. So in terms of enabling the participation of various ages. And I was really daunted at the beginning to work, especially with very young children, I have to say. But maybe an illustration shows how I navigated that. So this is a group of siblings, and so the 9-year-old boy wanted to be called Tro in this study, and the 5-year-old girl Lilith. So they were siblings, and I was realizing already that Lilith was not so interested in talking to me about her hobbies or her daily life. So I started working more with Tro and asked him about a scene from his life that he likes to remember. And he drew his last birthday, which is the first picture. And then later on throughout the afternoon, Lilith, all of a sudden, she took the piece of paper and started adding people and adding initials of people who are important for her. And lots of balloons and hearts and illustrating the scene. So that was then really the gateway to start engaging with her about who important people in her life were, why this day was so important for her, and etc. So in this case, Lilith kind of dictated how she wanted to participate in the research study to a certain extent. So I try to give children the space to participate in the research on their own terms as much as possible, which took time in terms of getting to know them well, but also then, yeah, was a very individualized approach. Great, so now coming to some of the key findings. So in terms of understandings of children's well-being that I encountered, so what I did was, as mentioned previously, I mapped the different themes that I encountered across different respondent groups to my conceptual framework. So in the center, you can see the central circle is are the different themes that children mentioned in relation to their understanding of well-being, and the two outer circles are those of professionals. So what this shows at an immediate glance is that well-being was understood in a really multidimensional way, and especially in relation to children, was very focused on relational and subjective well-being. So there were many more themes related to those two areas than material well-being, for example. Whereas when I posed the same question in relation to adults, the picture was completely reversed, which indicates that in this particular context, material well-being was seen to be in the adult realm of responsibilities, and yeah, less so in that of children. And I will speak a little bit later about how I noticed also that the majority of support services were very much geared towards material well-being and missed out children's relational and subjective well-being to a certain extent. What I also uncovered in this particular diagram is that there were a lot of overlaps in themes. So that's depicted by when a bubble, for example, crosses over lines. But there were also a lot of discrepancies in understandings. And they were mainly informed by, for example, differences in gender, age, generation, but also notions of identity and belonging. So maybe just to talk about some examples. So younger children, they talked about well-being a lot in relation to adults. So for example, they talked about being happy if I can make my parents happy. But older children, especially from the age of 12 onwards, they talked, and that was in this context seen as a marker towards the transition to adulthood. They talked a lot about being yourself and not being judged, which was especially reflective of some conflicts with older grandparents' generations. So, for example, there were a lot of views in families about kind of being proper or not engaging in any romantic relationships before marriage. And so these, especially teenage girls, were talking about this notion of being able to be yourself as a key marker for well-being. Perhaps what's also an interesting example to pick out is in terms of notions of discipline and parenting. So for adult family members, they focused much more on behavioral factors when talking about children's well-being. So they talked about children being disciplined, not arrogant and polite, and respecting elders. And they saw this as a really Syrian Armenian trait. So this is how Syrian Armenian children were expected to behave in families. And they often then talked about the difference to local Armenian children in that regard. But then looking at the perspectives of professionals, they said that this type of disciplinary practice in families was counterproductive to children's well-being. They said that this inhibited their freedom and self-confidence and self-esteem. So this also indicates that there were different notions of how children should be positioned in families and different notions of childhood coming together in these types of interventions. So whereas family life in Armenian communities in Syria was organized in quite an autonomous way and regulated within the family system, in Armenia, the families experienced a shift of the position of children in families towards rights holders and centers of attention rather than the elders in the family. And perhaps the last interesting thing to mention here is also that many of the professionals superimposed their well-being understandings with identity and what was perceived to be a good migrant child. So they spoke about, for example, children having local friends or speaking the Eastern Armenian language as indicators for well-being. But there were not only discrepancies, so there were also similarities and understandings, especially when it comes to education. But then again, when digging a little bit deeper into understandings of education and their repercussions, a more diverse picture emerges. So in one of the well-being workshops, children were asked to draw a child not doing well and a child doing well. And this 12-year-old boy in the first picture spoke about a child not doing well who can't play because he's studying. And he said there's people, children outside, and he's watching it but can't engage in play with them. And on the second picture, a child doing well was depicted by another boy as having a test at school and getting a 10 out of 10, which in the Armenian system is actually near impossible. So the government gives you a certificate if you manage to get a 10 out of 10. So this indicates that children were navigating quite high expectations towards their education. And you can't see the quote on the slide there, but one of the mothers said, "I want them to be the best. 10 out of 10 is not enough." And then they were also confronted by ideas of professionals in terms of some children still not speaking Eastern Armenian and still speaking in the dialect of Western Armenian. So what I encountered then was that children worked really hard to do exceptionally well at school, engage in lots of extracurricular activities, to comply with these high educational expectations. But when they did not, then that could really have an effect on their well-being experiences. And inadvertently, some of the support services were really focused on improving children's performance at school. So inadvertently then also exacerbating these high expectations on children. Great. So what we've seen in this group of findings is that the wellbeing and development framework worked quite well in relation to children in the way that I modified it, because and it also, as the Bath scholars say, they said that well-being is a multidimensional process that shifts over time and space, and is a very relational and intersectionally driven concept, which I also found the children talked about. And what was perhaps interesting in this particular context and using it in a mobility setting is that well-being understandings were often superimposed by notions of what it means to be a good child, a good diaspora Armenian child, a good local Armenian child, and the children are navigating these different types of expectations in their daily lives. So now coming to the relationship between well-being and mobility. So how did children's mobility experiences and their future aspirations actually relate to their well-being experiences and also strategies towards well-being? So first of all, here it's important to note that the families that I met actually went through multiple trajectories. So it wasn't just a one-time move from Syria to Armenia, but actually the majority of families, they moved first to Lebanon, for example, or to Jordan and lived there for several years, tried to apply for asylum elsewhere, for example, in Europe, North America, or Australia. And when that didn't succeed, then they moved to Armenia. And some of the children really told me very adventurous stories of border crossings, trying to make it to Europe, which prompted one boy to say, yeah, it was like a Netflix movie. So that indicates that for many of the children and families, Armenia was a last resort. However, in terms of the newspaper coverage in Armenia and fundraising efforts for Syrian Armenians, this was framed largely as a homecoming. So I've called this the politics of homecoming, because children really experienced an incongruity between these narratives of homecoming and actually their decision to come to Armenia actually not being their primary wish at all. And this is, for example, just an example of a newspaper article which was often framed in the sense of Syrian Armenians are here to stay. There are repatriates, our brothers, which often didn't really comply with the feelings and belongings of children themselves. Children are also engaged a lot in TV interviews, for example, and different types of news coverage at that time. As I mentioned earlier, Syrian Armenians also had access to citizenship. However, not all chose to take it, especially young boys and men, because that would mean that they need to fight in the Armenian army. So that caused a patchwork of citizenships and statuses in the families that I encountered, and also caused situations of feeling stuck or being in protracted waiting, because these, especially families with boys, they couldn't return to Syria because they would also face army conscription there. And they were felt to a certain extent stuck in Armenia. And in spite of citizenship, the children and young people also encountered many terms to describe them, from refugees to repatriates, to people in a refugee-like situation, to brothers, to sisters. But what they really wanted to be recognized as was Syrian Armenians. So they wanted to be recognized as diaspora Armenians who had contributed to Armenia from afar and had also contributed to building Armenian identity. And this was often not recognized by local Armenians. They spoke a lot about narratives of aid dependency and class-related stereotypes when it came to Syrian Armenians. So against this backdrop, what did children and young people do? What were their strategies towards well-being? So what I uncovered were three main strategies, which were used quite flexibly by children in different types of situations. So the first one is well-being in adaptation, which talks about trying to cope with the move to Armenia, trying to settle, trying to engage in activities that might make them feel better in their new surrounding, and looking for distractions through schoolwork, for example. The second strategy towards well-being was well-being in motion. So that was a continued well-being strategy where some children and young people really wanted to move abroad again, or they wanted to move back to Syria and were actively working towards this. And the third well-being strategy was well-being in place. So that was actually an immobility strategy. So some of the children hardly talked about their mobility experiences in their narratives, and they weren't interested in moving elsewhere, and were quite happy with improving their well-being through other means in their daily lives. And these strategies were very much influenced by ad hoc opportunities, so maybe changes in their asylum applications to go elsewhere, how long they had been in Armenia, their age at arrival, so whether they had lots of school friends still back in Lebanon or Syria, family members being in Armenia or abroad. So to give an example, this social network map drawing by a 14-year-old boy, he actually drew his aunt as much closer than his parents. And for many of the children, not having extended family members and networks around was actually a big problem for their well-being, and they looked for means to keep in contact and perhaps go to live with the aunt in the future. But also interactions with institutions like church, school, or after-school clubs, and with peers could significantly impact how well children were feeling, and which strategies towards well-being they employed. And just a quick case example of 3 children that I met who had a very similar migratory trajectory. So Ani, Haik, and George, they all moved from Aleppo to Lebanon. They lived in Beirut for 5 years before moving to Armenia approximately 3 to 5 years ago. So Ani drew the first picture. So I asked the children to draw an important scene from their life that they think about a lot. And Ani chose to draw the scene from the airplane window when she arrived in Armenia. She spoke a lot in her narratives about adaptation, about bullying experiences at school, about not having her family network and how she was coping with that because she had only moved with her parents to Armenia. So her narratives were really, and her strategy was really focused on adapting, trying to adapt to life in Armenia in striving for well-being. The second picture was drawn by 14-year-old Haik. So he drew a basketball court, and in my interactions with him, I started to realize that he actually wanted to become a player in the NBA and move to the United States to be closer to some family members that were there. So he had this strategy of well-being in motion. So he was really trying to work towards moving abroad. And then the final picture is by 12-year-old George. So he drew a classroom scene that recently happened at school, where a child helped him and protected him in a fight with another child at school. And he talked a lot about how important it was to have good friends, but how much he liked Armenia and his school as well. And his narratives were hardly connected to his mobility experiences. He was also very happy to live in Armenia as opposed to his parents. So what these 3 case stories show is that the children prioritize different narratives depending on their subjective and relational well-being. And the material well-being of these children didn't play such a big role in terms of whether they used mobility as a tool towards well-being or not. And what these three case examples also show is that children who are quite flexible, at sometimes also adopting multiple strategies towards well-being, much more so than adults. So they were quite adept at navigating different social arenas with peers, for example, use different words, or sometimes Arabic if engaging with diaspora Armenians, sometimes using a Russian word here and there when engaging with Eastern Armenian children. So their diasporic identities became somewhat blurred at the return to the homeland, but they also knew how to instrumentalize those as they strove towards well-being. And the point I'd like to reiterate here is, again, the importance of relational and subjective well-being, which, especially in return mobilities contexts, I found that there was often an assumption that children have no issues in terms of relational and subjective well-being and their belonging, because they're Armenians in the end. And that really influenced then also the support services that I encountered. So as already mentioned, the majority of support services were very material well-being and adult focused. And there was an assumed trickle-down effect to children, which were informed by these assumptions of unproblematic belonging. There was a disconnect that I found between the aspects that children prioritized and what was actually available. So whereas children prioritized education quality, such as for example, anti-bullying measures at school, but also psychological support for adaptation to Armenia and not trauma in relation to the war. So they repeatedly reiterated that it was not about war traumas, but more adapting to Armenia that they needed help with, versus what was actually available. So many of the support services were focused on enhancing children's educational success, language skills, youth employment, and the very few psychological services that only one organization provided, there was much more demand than what was actually the capacity of the psychologist to work with the children. When it came to adults, I found that there were really similar types of economic empowerment support services. So there were many grants, entrepreneurial grants that families could apply to. However, the problem there was that they were often unattainable for families with lower educational backgrounds. And then what was then open, or opportunities in terms of economic empowerment provided by support service providers for adults who hadn't won a grant, for example, were quite gendered. So, the women in the families, they told me that they were offered, for example, service jobs like manicure or hairdressing, whereas they would have enjoyed perhaps other professions. So there was a risk of these types of gender and class biases in the economic support services that I encountered, which were often also informed by donor interests. So in terms of the access to support services, I found that there were both winners and losers. So some families were really savvy at navigating different support service providers. Yeah, we're really clear on, okay, I go to this organization for this support, to that one for that, to that one for that. But not all families were that adept at navigating. So some of them fell through the cracks. And the imminent end to support caused a lot of anxiety for these families who really depended on rental subsidies and the like. And I was in Armenia actually 2 weeks ago to present the findings and revisit the families that I worked with. And still, especially those that were not able to navigate the support services in the same way, still reported struggling with housing especially, and decent work. And across the support service providers themselves, there was a lot of competition to get beneficiaries, and limited coordination and communication, which was especially exacerbated as of 2019 when the ministry stopped coordinating support services for Syrian Armenians. There was no central database, so there were a lot of overlaps and duplication of services. So coming to the end, some of the conclusions and contributions of this study. So as already mentioned, assumptions of unproblematic belonging in return mobilities contexts can severely hinder the effectiveness of well-being support services. These underlying assumptions that children are doing well in any case in their relational and subjective well-being was sometimes even counterproductive for their well-being. What was interesting to see is that children were really adept at forging new strategies and identities for themselves, which reached beyond common tropes that they encountered in terms of this is how an Eastern Armenian child is, this is how a Western Armenian child is. And they used different aspects of these flexible identities in different social arenas. Conceptually, I can say that using well-being in this extended approach as a concept brought quite some novel insights when exploring things like mobility. So how does mobility relate to well-being as a concept? How are they both used as a tool towards well-being, for example? And the same thing comes with childhood. So this multi-actor mapping onto the well-being framework really helped me tease out different notions of what a good child means to different types of respondents in this context. What was also good about the well-being concept is that it was generally well understood by children of different ages in this context. And I also like the positive spin of well-being. I myself am quite an optimist, but not only that, it's enabling children to have an open context and enabling children to share aspects of their lives that they prioritize rather than using a narrow migration lens, for example, in this particular mobilities context, which I found really useful. But I also have to say it's a very messy concept. So there are lots of different interpretations of well-being. So it can take quite a lot of time then to really understand and tease out some of the similarities and differences in understandings and what they then mean and why. So for repatriation policy in Armenia, and I had a big discussion 2 weeks ago with UNHCR about this, is that citizenship is not a sufficient state policy for repatriation. There was an assumption by the Armenian government that, okay, if they get access to citizenship, that's enough, that's all we have to do. But that was not true. So if the Armenian government does wish for sustainable return mobilities to Armenia, then more support services beyond the material realm need to be provided to these population groups. And then finally, for practice, I can't stress enough how important it would be to involve children and families in service design and to complement existing well-being frameworks with the experiences of children as they navigate all of these different social relationships in their lives. So involving them could really deepen the effectiveness of services and make them more holistic to really consider support services for material well-being, but also subjective and relational well-being. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rosie. That was really enlightening. Thank you. Does this work? Yes, it does. Okay, so we have some time for questions and comments. I'd just like to welcome anyone who has something to ask about this very rich and interesting study. Please.
Hi there, thanks very much, really interesting. I just wondered about, you did mention something about the children's understanding of the concept of well-being, and I was just wondering whether you use the word in English, or did they have a word in one of the other languages that kind of mapped onto well-being, or just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much. Yeah, indeed. So together with my research assistants, we went through different local phrases of what well-being can mean. So there was some in both Eastern and Western Armenian, but also in Arabic, very day-to-day expressions, which kind of spoke more about this, as I'm in a good state, which was more understandable for children in this context. So I usually, I wouldn't use well-being as a term with the children, but rather these types of simple expressions of daily life, kind of what makes you feel good. So more in that sense, so tailoring it to different respondent groups. When it came to the professionals, they were very well versed at hearing the term well-being, but then that actually sometimes made it difficult for them to really articulate it, because they had their indicator frameworks, for example, that they used on a regular basis, which came together to form well-being. So that was also interesting to see those different understandings of that concept.
Thanks, Rosie, for presenting such interesting work to us. What you did is really impressive. I have two questions. Can I ask them? You don't have to answer them both, but what's a chewing gum? Sorry. My first question is, you mentioned that you spoke to some children as young as 5, and I wondered if there were differences in how children, if you spoke to them who were born in Armenia compared to if their siblings weren't born in Armenia, if they were born in Syria, if they had different interpretations. But I understand you might not have spoken to families like that, so ignore that question if it's not relevant. And my other question, because I'm not in the child space at all, but is what you did similar to what people call a child-centered approach? And do organizations take like an, in air quotes, child-centered approach? And what does that mean in practice if they are doing it?
Thanks so much, Sophie, for those really good questions. So yes, in fact, especially actually the example of the 2 siblings, Tro and Lilith. Lilith was born in Armenia, whereas Tro was not born in Armenia. And the siblings actually made quite some differentiation across, when I, for example, asked them about what their personal flag would look like, then the siblings would say, oh, she's going to say 100% Armenian. And then Lilith came in and said Canada. So she was really playing with the concept of citizenship and identity, knowing that she is perceived differently by her siblings for being born in Armenia. So I have to say that there was, even among children who were born in Armenia and those who weren't, the wide array of different identities and belongings, percentages of how much I feel Armenian, Lebanese or Syrian were so different and not so much determined by birthplace, and they also changed over time. So sometimes percentages for Armenia got bigger as they felt better in Armenia, and sometimes it stayed the same or even became smaller if they had adverse experiences in Armenia. So a really interesting question, because lots of different interpretations and ways of children to deal with these different perceptions of identity and belonging. And in terms of the child-centered approach, it's a good question. So the organizations and the support services did mention or say that they also provide child-centered services. But then when asking more about how these services were planned and in terms of whether children were involved, that was more to a lesser extent. With the exception of young people who they said would articulate more easily what the needs were. But especially younger children were rarely involved in the design of services. But the idea of a child-centered approach and research also really intrigued me throughout the project in terms of what that really means. and how to navigate that during the analysis process also of the data, because there was, of course, much more data from adults and not that much data from children in comparison. But then how to balance that out and make sure that the experiences and narratives of children still take center stage in the analysis phase was really tricky, and there wasn't that much literature on how to do that. So I drew more on social work practice texts, for example, to see how they navigate child-centeredness when they do their casework with families, for example.
Anna?
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Rosie. That was really interesting. Great to hear about your work. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the photo voice element of the research, because I did photo voice for my doctoral study, so it's like a personal interest for me, and just sort of how you integrated that with the other sort of disparate elements that you looked at, sort of in, you know, particularly in your analysis, sort of how you analysed that work, and particularly because I think you said that you hadn't originally intended to do that part of the work. So yeah, thank you.
Great question. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, exactly. So the photo voice kind of emerged. There were 6 children in the family case studies who were interested in trying out the method. So we did 2 sessions, 2 workshop sessions. The first one, I engaged a Syrian Armenian photographer who could tell the children a little bit about how to take photographs in an ethical way, for example. That's also in that session, we defined a joint research question, which the children were interested in exploring. Most of them had access to a smartphone, so that's what we used. In the case of one boy, I gave him one of my old ones that he could use for the photo voice, and they were all very adept at using a smartphone, so that wasn't so difficult for them, but they did get some pointers on how to take pictures, etc., from the photographer. And then we also looked at some pictures together to think through kind of how to analyze jointly what pictures can tell us as a reflection for when they would go home and out, and we would meet a couple of days later to look at pictures that they'd taken. So they sent me the pictures via WhatsApp, and then I printed them out in big, and we had a discussion about the different pictures and then collated what home means in that sense. And the results were really fascinating because especially for the older children and the photographer actually, they also brought some existing photographs from their homes in Syria. Whereas the younger children, they chose more to take pictures of aspects of their daily life. So for example, their school or church, which was really important for them. Or the scene when they look out of their bedroom window. So there were lots of different interpretations of what makes children feel home. And then in terms of bringing that together with all of the data, so I kind of used all of that joint analysis as the kind of written data that I then coded and analyzed later on, and used kind of put together then per theme different sort of using the mosaic approach by Clark and Moss, kind of bringing together different mosaics from children's lives that I had collected from them over time, and then analyzing them at a family level, but also across children, and trying to understand then how different intersectional factors influence those, well-being understandings, so to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie, very, very much for your presentation. Talking about class, did you have like a, I don't know, comparison or something of drawings with child of different classes? Did you find like any difference or something like that?
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
a really good question, because I didn't talk about that a lot actually. I I included the concept of class because Syrian Armenian communities are generally seen as middle or upper class diaspora communities. Many of the children then encountered narratives from their peers in terms of you're rich or you have lots of money. That's why you're taking a taxi and things like that. Though the reality was very different. So many Syrian Armenians couldn't take their assets with them. It was not possible to sell anything, for example, during the war. But also not all of the Syrian Armenians that I encountered had very kind of high material status. So there was a lot of variation in that as well, but there were these stereotypes about Syrian Armenians being upper class that they were confronted with. So I analyzed class in that sense to see how children encountered these types of narratives in their daily lives and how that then affected their well-being.
Any other questions? Oh.
So there's a question online from Heather, congratulating you with a lovely presentation and asking if you interpreted silences and what was not said by the kids as an expression or a unit of measuring, of meaning, a unit of meaning during your analysis. That was one question. And a second one, can you also say more about how you navigated interactions with children when their parents and teachers were present from when they may not have been? So if you had chance to see the kids with and without parents.
Really good question. Thanks a lot, Heather. So I did take note of silences and certain gestures in the interactions with the children, and also always kind of wrote my perspectives of interactions in my field diary, which I would then kind of integrate into the data. Just trying to think of an example of something that was not said. I can only think of an adult at the moment, where there was an adult who spoke about the different support services that he got from various organizations. So I got this from there, and I got that from there, and then he just realized and looked at me and made a very apologetic gesture, kind of feeling almost ashamed, telling me that he had taken advantage, or that's how he was worried about being seen, of all these different support service providers. So that's something, for example, that I also noted down, and that was important because he obviously didn't want the perception to be created that he was freeloading, which was another narrative that they had been encountering. And in terms of interactions with children and families, that's a really good question, and one that I grappled with a lot, because originally I had planned to do one-on-one work with the different family members. But then when I arrived, that wouldn't either have been appropriate nor culturally normal in the setting, because all the interactions happen in the living room. So there's also logistically, there wouldn't have been space to go somewhere else in the family home. And it would have been also very strange for me to go with a child someplace else. And so I had to kind of redo the methodology to a certain extent to take into account that children were in their families, and that family members might have been around during the interactions, which was actually turned out to be really interesting in terms of also analyzing interactions between peers, interactions with adults, how adults sometimes influence narratives of children, and sometimes children pushed back or resisted against those. So those family dynamics actually turned into a really big part of the analysis of how children rejected or resisted different expectations towards them and their well-being. But I also did one-on-one work. So once I got to know the children better, but also the adults, some of them reached out and wanted to speak to me alone. Also, adults sometimes wanted to have the freedom to share more details without having their children there. So it was a bit of a mix between really dynamic family interviews where I tried as much as possible to work individually with family members, but also spend time together and look at different dynamics, but also individual interactions that then emerged over time.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Really interesting. My question is on the well-being framework and how you came to the decision to use that, for the research. Did you think about other possible frameworks before zeroing in on this one, or this has always been the particular framework that has been appropriate for this piece of work?
Thanks so much, Charity. That's a really good question. And yeah, at the beginning, actually, I wasn't so interested in material well-being per se, or at looking at that. I was more interested in aspects of identity and belonging, and to see how that shapes well-being. So more, yeah, in the subjective realm, perhaps, and how that's influenced by different factors. But then upon talking to the local team, as I was preparing for the fieldwork, they kept on mentioning how important material well-being is for Syrian Armenians, and how that is one of the main areas that they're struggling with. And here they were mainly referring to adults. So that really made me reflect on the fact that, okay, maybe I was missing this important aspect. And I encountered the well-being in development approach and found it a really good one in the sense of seeing well-being not necessarily as an outcome, but something that can shift over time and space, which fits quite well in such a context of mobility where you have different notions of place. Yeah. And that can then also shift over time, and temporalities are really important, which was also the case then for these children in terms of periods of adaptation and things like that. So that's why then this framework seemed to be holistic enough to let different things emerge. It wasn't always easy to map all the themes to the right dimension. But instead of being too rigid about that, and then because some scholars, they also analyze the 3 dimensions separately, I decided not to do that and to look more on how these different dimensions dynamic and interact with one another.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. Yeah, thanks very much. I found the thesis fascinating and incredibly strong on theory and method and analysis. But a couple of words come to mind. One is about fluidity and receptivity. I think your work in the field, much of the conceptualization and theorization and even the methodology kind of emerges from an attitude to fieldwork that's been very receptive to experiences in the field. It's been really the opposite of the kind of well-being measures, frameworks and so on. These have emerged from your interaction with people. And one aspect of the work that I found really engaging was the way you allowed family members, children, adults to kind of almost define you in the field and use that in a really rich and evocative way. I think you used the phrase incompetent adult, was that right? You allowed the kids to see you as an incompetent adult, but that gave them a kind of platform for talking about their cultural world and their well-being. And I think there's a fantastic lessons from your fieldwork experience just the kind of almost organic and naturalistic way you approach the field. Because I think all the kind of more standard academic outputs kind of derive and are enhanced from that positioning. So I was, in terms of a question, it's maybe, I just wonder if you could give a couple of tasters of your time in the field and instances of adaptability and kind of maybe changing your agenda slightly in response to this family situation.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that observation and question. And one particular situation comes to mind with a 3-year-old that I actually worked with, where I was really apprehensive in terms of how best to work with him. And so kind of we started just playing with his toys, and he showed me his toys and yeah, and told me different colors that he knows in English and things like that. So that's how we kind of started to engage. And he immediately noticed that I was not capable at speaking Armenian. So that's where the incompetent adult comes in. And he actually then kind of realized that, yeah, I'm probably incompetent in general at how things run at his household. So he took me into the kitchen and started opening different drawers, telling me, okay, this is a knife and a fork, or opening the fridge and saying, this is a Coca-Cola, you can drink that, and kind of just showing me around the whole apartment, and kind of letting those things happen. And the whole family followed us, and everyone was laughing and thought the scene was incredibly amusing, but kind of letting your guard down and letting these types of situations emerge was quite important to then learn more about his likes and dislikes and how he was doing in kindergarten and things like that. So I guess, yeah, being really, as you said so nicely, kind of receptive to different children and how they interact with adults, and especially then having this, or how to navigate this barrier of foreignness. So that was always a big worry for me, but then also I tried to use that to my advantage, because I was an incompetent adult in the setting, and I kind of showing them that I was really interested in learning from them and their experiences. It's kind of the approach.
Yeah, yeah. I think going forward, if you're interested, it may be something you could consider writing about, the kind of texture of field work in the kind of more organic context, and how theory methods emerge. Because I think it's a very valuable insight you provide, which shouldn't be lost. Yeah.
Oh, that's a
Sure,
great idea. Thank you.
Can I also ask a question, please? So now you, of course, well-being is front and center of your analysis, but behind that, there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of theorizing around mobilities and immobilities, and they come out a little bit of the different strategies in place and in mobility and so forth. But actually, you have much more of a discussion about drawing on the migration mobility literature and diaspora literature and return diaspora. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, and maybe also think about writing on well-being, using well-being to tease out some of these things? So think about publications on that frame towards mobility studies.
Really good question, Dorothy. Yeah, I have to say that was almost the most challenging thing to navigate, all of the migration, diaspora, return, mobilities, transnationalism literature and really, and when I found out about the return mobilities concept, I was very relieved because it brings together aspects of diaspora, of transnationalism, which were really important to this particular research context, and also hadn't been used before. It had been used kind of, there was a really great study on return migrant children to Ireland that I referenced a lot, and that helped me a lot in terms of analyzing these types of return mobilities. But yeah, coming to your question of mobility and immobility, I think putting those two terms in relation to well-being was then really helpful to tease out these different strategies. And there's a lot of theory around mobility and immobility already. And there's different terms used like acquiescent mobility, immobility, or voluntary immobility. And so I tried to bring together these theories to see how they would fit in the three strategies that I encountered by the children. And they actually fit, I would say, quite neatly to a certain extent. So for me, it was quite refreshing to say I'm doing this study about children's well-being and not necessarily about diaspora Armenians, because it then opened up kind of different experiences of mobility or immobility to emerge quite organically.
So, any last questions? Charity.
Rosie, you mentioned that you went back to Armenia to share your findings with the research participants. You know, how was that received? You know, was there anything surprising that came out of your work to them? You know, were there particular expectations at the time of engaging your field work that, you know, was not met from their perspective? You know, how was the dynamics generally in terms of your feedback with them?
That's a really good question. So I met with the children and families, but also with some of the organizations. So it was a mix of kind of informal meetings and having ice cream and coffee to kind of formal presentations that I did during the time I was there. And I could say from the perspective of the children and families, they were just really happy that I had come back. And because I was already delayed with coming back, but I had promised, so I really wanted to go back. So the immediate reaction was just, it was nice that I had kept my word and that I had come back. And the children were actually really thrilled to see their pictures in the thesis. So I took pictures of them, looked at the text around, asked me questions about what certain things mean that I wrote about, and were also interested in looking at what other children had drawn and which types of images I had included. And for the parents, it was more, I almost got a sense of that they were happy that their stories were told, and they asked me a lot about more about some of the recommendations or kind of what I had talked about in terms of the Armenian government and the support services. Yeah, they were quite happy to hear that, yes, some of the support services might have not been as effective as many of the providers desired, which they also saw in the same way. So in general, it was quite positive in terms of the interactions. I didn't manage to meet with everyone. So some of them didn't have time or had changed their numbers. Not all of the children and families. And then in terms of the organizations, I think the most interesting debate was at UNHCR, because they became really triggered by the phrase homecoming or last resort. And there were different there were local Armenians, but also international expats in the room. And the international expats, they often said, well, Armenia is a good practice example in the international sector, having, you know, offered citizenship.
Yeah.
But but then at the same time, this meant that these families lost refugee status and then weren't entitled to additional support services necessarily. So that was one thing. And also the local Armenians then really questioned this and said, yeah, was that really the right avenue for the government to take? Because half of the Syrian Armenians are left. The repatriation, are only left. So the repatriation policy goals of the government haven't necessarily come to fruition because families are still struggling with housing and there's no social housing and they don't have access to that. So so there were lots of debates around what it means to come home and how to support people coming back, which I guess might become more and more relevant in current times with increasing restrictive migration measures, and at least in Austria, where I live, people being sent back and whole families being sent back after years of living abroad. And then question is how best to support these return mobilities if it can't be prevented in the first place. You know.
Yeah, plenty of work to do.
Yes.
Okay, well, just to say thank you immensely. It was a really wonderful presentation and brilliant to hear your responses to all these questions. So thank you very much, Rosie.
Thanks, everyone.